what's yours like? You want to walk us through kind of how a standard is made and kind of like what are you doing to help facilitate that process?
Sure. It's an exercise in herding cats is how it usually is described. And the way it usually works, it doesn't matter which standards development organization or SDO that does the work, the process is pretty much the same. Usually a project is proposed, and that project will have a sponsor of some kind. In the SAE world, we refer to them as a document sponsor, but we have typically a primary technical point of contact that helps to shepherd the entire document through its development and its balloting process. But basically, that project is proposed to the committee. It gets kind of the thumbs up or green light from the steering committee that this is indeed what the industry is looking for. There are typically expectations on usage for that document before it's released. So there typically has to be, in the case of SAE, for simplicity, if we're talking about a powder specification, there has to be at least one producer and 2 users. The same is true for the end use material. There has to be at least enough traction already out there to justify the time and energy spent and the release of that document. So we have to show that there's sufficient reason to do the work. But once we've gotten the green light, it typically comes down to the document sponsor to write that rough draft, and if necessary, work with kind of a working group on an as-needed basis. And for that last document I mentioned, we spent about 2 years meeting every week to discuss the contents of the draft and keep just massaging it over and over and over again. And that working group contained participants from industry in the powder production space, the users of the technology. We had representation from academia. We had representation from federal regulatory bodies. So the FAA was present. So we had everybody under the sun working on this document with me over the span of 2 years until finally it's at a point where we think, okay, we've gotten it good enough to push it out for its first ballot to get formalized comments back from people. And once we get those comments back, we're able to then basically start to fine tune the language that's in the document, make sure that we're not saying something unintentionally or allowing some loophole to be present. But after, I think that document went through at least 3 different ballot cycles before it finally started to show up in what's called a limited scope ballot. So we had enough of the document with a minimum number of technical negative comments responding back that we could start to say, this portion of the document's done, we're only going to focus on this narrow section here. And so it went through a couple limited scope ballots until finally, I think we got enough buy-in from the committee at large after meeting the minimum vote requirements by the members of the committee that it finally was complete. And then it's got to go through a whole different ballot cycle with the Aerospace Council at SAE. And that's kind of a last check by people that are not part of the Aerospace AM Materials Committee. So they'll get to look at it once, and then if nobody has any issues with it and it gets approved, it then probably sits kind of in a document prep cycle for about a month or 2 by SAE or whoever the SDO is, and then it shows up available for purchase by the industry at large. So quite an involved process, but some of these documents take a lot of work, and we like to put out good documents, so they require the attention that they receive. So they're not something we do just overnight, but I'm expecting this next one to take probably just as long as that last one, just because of how important it is. And so there's a lot of people kind of saying, hey, I want to help. Like, that's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, but we'll get it done. We'll get it done.
Yeah, and I mean, kudos to you for the volunteer hours and days and weeks, the years that it takes to get something over the line, because you're inspecting every single word, every single concept, and things are constantly changing, right?
Right.
And the personalities and egos that you have to manage.
Oh,
it's
yes.
Probably not an easy chore. That's
right. The other thing I probably is worth mentioning is that as the industry begins to develop these standards, the intersecting web of the documents becomes more and more complicated. And so we try to anticipate early on how the documents work together to create basically an interconnected set of documentation to help standardize the entire workflow. And that's really important to appreciate when we talk about things like when we call out a powder spec, that powder spec cites the powder production process control spec. And that powder spec also calls out our powder sizing document. And so there's all these interrelated reference documents. And the same is true for the one we just released, that we point back out to a bunch of other documents that we have to make sure that we're not in conflict with, that we are able to properly cite and leverage, and that suddenly the way we're using it doesn't get revised out or something changes. And so there's a lot of, you have to think multiple moves ahead to make sure that the work you're doing is somewhat self-supporting in the ecosystem you're in, but that you're kind of anticipating the needs of the industry as well. So there's just this back and forth juggle that happens with coming up with the right language on these documents.
For sure.